Two people. Two completely different relationships with the same institution. One spent her career studying the British monarchy from the outside, playing three different queens across stage and screen, and ended up describing herself, half joking, but only half, as a queenist. The other was born inside the institution, spent 3 decades living it, and eventually walked away from it in public, on television, in a 400-page memoir. Neither one has ever sat across from the other and argued about it. But if you put their own words side by side, you get something more interesting than a staged fight. You get two honest, fully formed points of view on what duty costs and what it's worth. This is a story about those 2 points of view. Start with Helen Mirren, because her position is the less obvious one. She didn't grow up sympathetic to the monarchy. She said plainly more than once that her parents were the opposite, vehemently anti-monarchist, suspicious of the class system the crown sits on top of. That's the household she came from. If you'd asked teenage Helen Mirren what she thought of the royal family, queenist would not have been the word. Then she got cast as Elizabeth II. It was 2006. The film was simply called The Queen, and it covered one of the most unflattering weeks of Elizabeth's entire reign, the aftermath of Princess Diana's death, when the monarch stayed silent at Balmoral while the public grieved in the streets, and the tabloids turned on her for it. Mirren didn't play a triumphant queen. She played a queen at her most exposed, most out of step with her own country, closest to losing the public's patience entirely. And by her own account, the research changed her mind about the woman underneath the role. She's described immersing herself in biographies and archival footage and coming out the other side with what she called a growing respect for Elizabeth. Respect she felt strongly enough about that she actually wrote to the Queen directly during filming, unsure even how to properly address the letter, just to say that studying her had left Mirren with more admiration than she'd expected to feel. The Queen's office wrote back a formal, impersonal reply. Mirren has said she was relieved she sent the letter anyway. She won the Oscar for that performance. She went on to play Elizabeth II again in stage and pageant performances, and played Elizabeth I twice more besides, 3 different queens across her career, which by her own count makes her something like the monarchy's most persistent screen chronicler. In a 2015 interview, host Fareed Zakaria pushed her directly on the contradiction. How do you keep playing the Queen while still holding the political position that Britain shouldn't have won? Mirren didn't dodge it. She confirmed she still thinks of herself as basically anti-monarchist in principle, then immediately complicated it. She called herself a queenist, said she'd genuinely come to love the Queen specifically, and drew a distinction a lot of people don't bother drawing. She could believe the individual people in that family were decent and hardworking, could respect what the role demanded of Elizabeth personally, while still finding the institution itself hard to justify in the abstract. That's a more layered position than supports the monarchy. It's closer to, I don't believe in the system, but I believe in what I watched this particular woman do with her life inside it. When Elizabeth died in 2022, Mirren's tribute used a phrase that stuck. She said the Queen was, with or without the crown, the epitome of nobility, the with or without doing a lot of work, separating the woman from the title one more time. She also called herself proud to be an Elizabethan. Months before that, at the Platinum Jubilee, she'd stood in an arena near Windsor Castle in costume and delivered a tribute in character, thanking the Queen on behalf of what she called a grateful nation for 70 years of what she described as unswerving leadership through difficult moments. It's worth remembering that was a scripted performance for an event, but Mirren has been consistent enough about the sentiment behind it across 2 decades and multiple unscripted interviews that it reads less like a hired line and more like something she'd actually come to believe. The through line in everything Mirren has said publicly is this: her admiration was earned through research, not birthright. She studied an institution she didn't originally trust, found a specific person inside it whose discipline impressed her, and said so repeatedly, consistently, for the better part of 20 years, using her platform to make an argument for duty as something that can be a source of meaning rather than only a source of constraint. Now the other half of the story, and it's worth saying up front, Prince Harry isn't arguing against Mirren's version of events. He's arguing against a different question entirely. Not was Elizabeth admirable, but what does it feel like to be inside this machine as a living person, right now, rather than studying it from a research desk? Harry's public case has been built in stages, and it's worth walking through them in order, because the escalation matters. It started with the 2021 Oprah interview, sitting beside Meghan, where he described tension with his father and brother and alleged that conversations inside the family had touched on the color of his and Meghan's unborn child's skin, a claim that landed like a genuine earthquake in British public life, precisely because nobody with that level of proximity to the family had ever said anything like it on camera before. Then came the Netflix documentary series with Meghan, further laying out their account of leaving royal life, the media pressure they said drove that decision, and what they described as institutional indifference to their well-being. Then, in January 2023, the memoir, Spare. Harry has been explicit about why he wrote it. He said the goal wasn't to settle scores, but to tell a story with what his publisher called unflinching honesty, and to try to correct what he's called the mistruths that had built up around him over the years. His stated belief being that truth is the precondition for any future reconciliation with his family, not an obstacle to it. In the book itself, he writes about growing up very aware from a young age of the accident of birth that made him the spare rather than the heir, a phrase he uses to describe the built-in second-tier status he says shaped his entire childhood, down to small practical details, like the royal travel rule that he and his father and brother could never all fly together, for succession security reasons, while no equivalent rule applied to him, because, as he puts it, the spare could always be spared. He's written about feeling like his royal life sometimes blurred into performance, describing the sensation, in his own words, that being royal wasn't all that far from being on stage, that acting was acting no matter the context. In interviews around the book's release, he made the specific privacy argument that later became central to how his critics characterize him. And that's worth stating precisely because it's frequently flattened. His claim isn't that his family owes him nothing, and he owes them nothing back. He's actually said the opposite, that he wants his father and brother back, that reconciliation matters to him, that the door isn't closed on his end. His claim is narrower, that his attempts to handle disagreements privately were repeatedly undercut, in his account, by leaks and planted stories from within royal circles, and that the family's traditional motto of never complain, never explain functioned in practice as a one-way rule, silence expected from him, while in his telling, information moved out about him anyway. Whether that account of leaking is accurate is contested. Palace sources have pushed back on it, and it isn't something that can be independently verified from outside. But it's the actual shape of Harry's argument, and it's different from simple grievance. It's a claim about being held to a code that he says wasn't being applied evenly. Since leaving official royal duties, Harry and Meghan have built a lasting media and commercial footprint. The memoir, the Netflix deal, paid speaking engagements, and Archewell, their charitable foundation. That last part is where public scrutiny has landed hardest and fairly, measured against royal charitable institutions built over decades like the Prince's Trust, which has documented outcomes for hundreds of thousands of young people over almost 50 years. A foundation only a few years old is inevitably going to look thin by comparison on hard metrics. That's less a specific failing of Harry's than a basic fact about how long it takes any philanthropic organization to accumulate a track record. But it is a real, fair point that critics have raised, and it's one Harry hasn't fully answered in public beyond describing Archewell as a work in progress. If you strip away the invented confrontation and just look at what's real, the disagreement between what Mirren represents and what Harry represents isn't actually about whether the monarchy is good or bad. It's about something narrower and more interesting, whether an institution can ask this much of a person and still be worth defending, and whether leaving it publicly, loudly, and profitably is a betrayal of that institution or the most honest thing a person in Harry's position could do. Mirren's answer, built from the outside, through research and imagination, is that duty like Elizabeth's, the daily discipline of putting the role ahead of your own preferences for 70 years, is something to admire on its own terms, independent of whether you'd sign up for the system that produced it. Harry's answer, built from the inside, through 3 decades of lived experience, is that the same discipline that looks admirable from a research desk can look like a slow erosion of a person's autonomy and privacy when you're the one actually living it. And that saying so publicly, even at real reputational cost, is more honest than staying silent about it would have been. Neither position disproves the other, because they're not actually answering the same question. Mirren is making a claim about what she found admirable in a specific woman's discipline. Harry is making a claim about what it costs a specific person to be held to that discipline against his will. You can believe both. Plenty of people do. The people who insist you have to pick one side or the other are usually the ones selling the fight, not describing it. What's true is that Britain has been having a real, unresolved conversation about exactly this tension for years. Monarchy as inherited duty worth honoring versus monarchy as an institution whose demands on its own family members deserve more scrutiny than they've historically gotten. Helen Mirren and Prince Harry didn't have that argument on a red sofa. But between what she said about Elizabeth for 2 decades and what he's written and said about his own life inside the same family, you can hear both sides of it clearly enough without anyone needing to invent the confrontation for you. If you want the sourcing behind any specific claim in this script, Mirren's 2015 CNN interview, her letter to the Queen as reported by Radio Times, Harry's Oprah interview, the spare excerpts, or his post-release press tour, I can pull the specific outlets and dates together separately.